In July of 2023, the U.S. Congress officially undertook its investigations of UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, or more commonly known as UFO. During these investigations, we received several testimonies from officials such as David Fravor as well as David Grusch. In these testimonies, they revealed that not only does the U.S. government have knowledge of UFOs, but that the U.S. government is in possession of alien spacecraft as well as potentially the bodies of the aliens themselves. I would like to use these testimonies to explore the difference in philosophy between justification, belief, and truth, and explore the role that evidence plays in forming what I would call a justified belief. What reason do we have to believe certain things, and are we justified in these beliefs? Justification is a fundamental aspect of critical thinking. It involves the ability to assess evidence, weigh arguments, and reach conclusions based on sound reasoning rather than intuition or emotion. There are various sources of justification, including empirical evidence, logical coherence, testimonial evidence, personal experience, and expert authority. Different beliefs may require different types of justification. In this video, we will explore the difference between justification and truth with respect to different belief claims. Although on a surface level, these two categories may appear to be closely related, there are some critical philosophical differences that ought to be pointed out. In order to explore these differences, we will take into consideration the recent congressional hearings related to UFOs and explore the testimonies of Commander David Fravor and intelligence official and whistleblower David Grusch. The recent congressional hearings have been touted by people on social media as an act of disclosure. That is, the claim that these hearings are an official proclamation by the government that alien life exists and that we have made contact with aliens. As we will see, these claims are bolstered by the testimony of David Grusch, who has made some rather astonishing claims. Specifically, Grusch has claimed that not only are these objects of potential extraterrestrial origin, but that the United States government has been keeping this a secret for the better part of the last century. This video will explore from a critical thinking and philosophical perspective whether or not these different claims are justified and whether or not we can put any merit into the truthfulness of these claims. In other words, has the US government recovered alien spacecraft? And have they been keeping it a secret? Let's find out together. Be sure to let me know what your opinion of these recent congressional hearings is and whether or not you believe that these claims are justified or can be justified or substantiated, and let me know what you think in the comments section below. I look forward to hearing from you on this topic. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be delving into these testimonies about UFOs and the claims that these different individuals are making. But before we get there, I want to make some distinctions, some philosophical distinctions, critical distinctions between a couple of different terms I'm going to throw around here, some of which you're probably already familiar with, but others you might be a little bit confused about. So first and foremost, I want to talk about the nature of belief, specifically the nature of what a justified belief looks like. Of course, when we're talking about the justification of belief, I think we also have to talk about evidence, the nature of evidence, and what I'll call the principle of proportionality. What sort of evidence is needed in order to justify particular beliefs? This will relate heavily to some concepts that I talked about in my video on the reptilian conspiracy, specifically in this distinction I make between two different sorts of logical thought or logical arguments. Deductive reasoning or deductive arguments on the one hand. If you can think back to that video, I said that deductive arguments, you can think of like mathematics or formal logic. Deductive arguments are arguments that are necessarily true, where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premise. If you want to think about it in terms of math, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room when it comes to basic arithmetic. 1 + 1 = 2. There's no probability there, right? Inductive reasoning or inductive arguments, on the other hand, there is room for probability. And inductive reasoning is what we use on a regular basis. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, as we'll see, because when we talk about justification or what sort of evidence we need, as I mentioned in that last video, with inductive reasoning, the conclusion does not follow necessarily in the sense that it follows within the realm of probability. That the conclusion, that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is probably or most likely the case. So I want to start off here with, I think, a rather straightforward example to kind of show you what I mean by this and for us to kind of ease into it a little bit in terms of justification of belief. So I have an example here, and this is a real life example as it relates to my house and the issues that I've been having with my house. But here we go. So this is what I say. I noticed that I have reduced water pressure in my guest bathroom sink and shower. Suspecting that something is wrong, I call a local plumber who comes out to my house. After the plumber performs his initial inspection, he informs me that there is a leak in a water pipe running to the guest bathroom, shows me a picture of a crack in the pipe, and gives me an estimate for repairs. All right, so from that, what can we say is the belief? Now, there are different beliefs that are operative here, but let's simplify it and say the belief that I hold is that something is wrong, something is happening in my bathroom, that something is going wrong because of the lack of water pressure that I'm getting. So I can kind of sum that up by saying, I believe there is something wrong with the plumbing in my guest bathroom. Now, in terms of justification, justification simply refers to what reason do I have to hold that belief? In other words, what makes me think that I'm right in that belief? What makes me believe that that claim is true? Now, before I unpack this, I want to call simple attention to the fact that in philosophy and critical thinking, as odd as it might sound, there's actually a difference between justification and truth with respect to inductive reasoning. And what I mean by that, as I've alluded to in previous videos, just because we are justified in believing something doesn't necessarily make it true. Because again, with inductive reasoning, there are other possibilities or other probabilities in terms of an explanation. There's still the possibility that I might be wrong, even if I have very good reason to believe that I'm not wrong. Okay, so what does justification look like in this example? Well, first and foremost, it's the experience that I'm having of the reduced water pressure. I can compare that to my past experience. Previously, when I washed my hands in the bathroom, I noticed that the water pressure was of a certain volume, and now I'm noticing that it's not. So I'm comparing it with my past experience. I call a plumber. In this case, a plumber would be an expert on matters pertaining to the water pressure in my bathroom. So I have an expert who is weighing in on the topic, who has come and looked at my plumbing and said, yes, in fact, there is something wrong. Not only do I have expert testimony in that regard, but this expert has documented what they have seen and observed. So in this case, I would say that I'm pretty well justified in believing that something is going wrong. And this, of course, would justify the amount of money I ought to spend on potentially having it repaired. And I did have it repaired, but the issue is still there. So, right. So we see that there's other stuff potentially at play here, which is separate from the question of, okay, well, is it true? Right. So I'm justified in this belief. But as I mentioned before, it could possibly be something else. Maybe it's not just that crack. Maybe it's an issue regarding the city sewage itself and how much water they're allowing to come to my house. I really don't know a whole lot about sewage, and I'm not going to pretend that this example makes much sense, but hopefully you can follow along with what I'm saying. So, am I justified in this belief? I would say so. And when we're looking at issues of justification, we consequently have to look at issues of evidence. What sort of evidence do I have to justify that belief? And in this case, I have several different pieces of evidence. Now, hopefully, that all seems pretty straightforward. Evidence is pretty straightforward. Evidence is the rationale or the reason that you have to believe a certain thing. And depending upon what subject matter we're talking about, evidence can include a whole wide range of different things depending upon the different discipline that we're using. If we're just having a casual conversation about everyday experience, then the primary piece of evidence I'm going to have for that is my previous experience of that thing. If we're dealing with a discipline like history, well, I'm not going to have experienced certain historical events, so I'm going to rely on other things such as primary and secondary sources. Likewise, if we're talking about scientific evidence, then we're also talking about different other sorts of measures and tools that we could utilize in terms of justifying particular claims in the form of experiments or even mathematical calculations. So evidence varies widely depending upon what sort of claim we're making and depending upon what sort of category that claim falls into. But there's another issue here, and this issue is a little bit more subtle, I guess is the right word here. And the issue is, how much evidence do we actually need in order to feel justified about a particular belief or about a particular claim? And there's no concrete answer for that. But there is sort of a general principle, and this general principle is credited to the philosopher David Hume, in that the amount of evidence for a belief or for a claim is largely dependent upon whether or not that claim itself corresponds to things that we are familiar with. That's an odd way to put it. Whether or not that belief or claim falls within the given realm of probability. Okay, what the heck do I mean by that? Well, let's take a different example. Let's say that you come over to my house and we're having a conversation over our dinner plans for that evening, and I tell you that my friend Marcus is on the way over and he should be arriving here around 6 o'clock or so. Now, in this scenario, would you be justified in believing my claim that my friend Marcus is coming over at 6? Well, it doesn't really seem that odd or off the wall, all things being equal, that I would have a friend. Now, that part may be odd for those of you listening, but it shouldn't be that odd that I would have a friend or that his name would be Marcus or that they would be coming over to join us for dinner if we had planned on having dinner. Because friendships and dinner and plans are something that all of us have experienced at some point in our lives, most probably speaking. However, if I were to go on and tell you that don't be surprised, but my friend Marcus is a unicorn, well, now we're dealing with a completely different sort of line of reasoning and type of claim, right? For that claim that Marcus is a unicorn, unicorns are not something that falls within your purview of common experiences. So that level or that bar of evidence that you would need in order for you to be convinced of my claim is going to be much higher if I just, from me just talking about my regular friend Marcus. So, this is what Hume says in a little treatise that he wrote called On Miracles. Though experience be our only guide in reasonings concerning matters of fact are a category of knowledge that deals with our experience, the empirical world, empirical facts. It must be acknowledged that this guide is not altogether infallible. Sometimes our experience can be wrong, but in some cases is apt to lead us into errors. All effects follow not with like certainty from their supposed cause. Some events are found in all countries and in all ages to have been constantly conjoined together. Others are found to have been more variable, right? Sometimes our experiences vary, and sometimes the things that we take as a given are not, in fact, going to be given. And sometimes to disappoint our expectations, so that in our reasoning concerning matters of fact, there are all imaginable degrees of assurance, from the highest certainty to the lowest species of moral evidence. So, an example that Hume gives here that I think is a pretty good example is that of weather. Now, if you've grown up in a particular area, you have a pretty good sense of what that area's seasons are going to be like. So, for example, I live in Savannah, Georgia, where it is extraordinarily hot and humid for most of the year. I'm currently filming this in the month of August, and August is like the month of July. It's hot and humid. Now, if you were to ask me what my weather prediction for next week would be, I would say hot and humid. Now, could I be wrong about that? Of course I could. So, what Hume is saying here is that in terms of matter and facts, in terms of statements or claims about our experiential world, we have to account for a variable. We have to account for a spectrum of responses there. It could be the case that next week's going to be mild and temperate. I highly doubt it, but it's within the realm of probability that that is the case. Hume goes on to say that a wise man, therefore, proportions his belief to the evidence. In such conclusions are founded on an infallible experience. He expects the event with the last degree of assurance and regards his past experience as foolproof for the future existence of that event. In other words, we proportion our response to the future in terms of what we have experienced or what we have come to expect based on our past. In the other case, he proceeds with more caution. He weighs the opposite experiments. He considers which side is supported by the greater number of experiments, to what side he inclines without a doubt and hesitation, and when at last he fixes his judgment, the evidence exceeds not what we properly call probability. So, when dealing with claims, kind of the default position, when we're dealing with claims about the common, ordinary, everyday world, our kind of default there is to kind of intuitively see where it falls within that realm of probability based on our past experiences of the world. And that's going to sort of dictate the amount or level of evidence that we need in order to be justified in the belief in that claim. So going back to the Marcus example, if I tell you my friend's name is Marcus and he's coming over at 6, it's not going to take a whole lot for you to believe that, in terms of, you're not going to ask me, well, prove to me that you have a friend Marcus, right? That's probably not going to happen. But if I tell you that my friend Marcus is a unicorn, most people are going to want some sort of evidence or proof to justify that claim. Okay, so let's keep all of that at the back of our minds and review some of this awesome footage that has come from these UFO hearings in Congress recently. Okay, so the first clip that we have is from David Fravor's opening statement in his testimony, in which he outlines his experience with the Tic Tac UFO while he was working as a commander in the Air Force.
As you know, my name is David Fravor. I'm a retired commander in the United States Navy. In 2004, I was a commanding officer of Strike Fighter Squadron 41, the world famous Black Aces. We were attached to Carrier Wing 11, stationed on board the USS Nimitz, and had begun a 2-month workup cycle off the coast of California. On this day, we were scheduled for a 2v2 air-to-air training with the USS Princeton as our control. When we launched off Nimitz, my wingman was joining up. We were told that the training was going to be suspended and we were going to proceed with real-world tasking. As we proceeded to the west, the air controller was counting down the range to an object that we were going to, and we were unaware of what we were going to see when we arrived. There, the controller told us that these objects had been observed for over 2 weeks, coming down from over 80,000 feet, rapidly descending to 20,000 feet, hanging out for hours, and then going straight back up. For those who don't realize, above 80,000 feet is space. We arrived at the location at approximately 20,000 feet, and the controller called merge plot, which means that our radar blip was now in the same resolution cell as the contact. As we looked around, we noticed that we saw some whitewater off our right side. It's important to note that the weather on this day was as close to perfect as you could ask for off the coast of San Diego. Clear skies, light winds, calm seas, no whitecaps from waves. So the whitewater stood out in a large blue ocean. All 4 of us, because we were in F-18Fs, so we had pilots and Wizzo in the back seat, looked down saw a white tic-tac object with a longitudinal axis pointing north-south and moving very abruptly over the water.
Okay, so Fravor gives his testimony about what he saw on that day when he was a commander in the Air Force. And basically, it can be summed up. Fravor doesn't explicitly say that this was aliens or that he saw a UFO craft, only that what he witnessed was absolutely incredible and that it exceeded, I guess you could say, the current technological capabilities of the U.S. government or any other aircraft that he was aware of. This is what he says in his closing statement. I would like to say that the Tic Tac object that we engaged in November 2004 was far superior to anything that we had at the time, have today, or are looking to develop in the next 10 plus years. So he's very conservative in the sense that the languages he's using, he's not making some extraordinary claim that this was in fact an alien and that he had in fact engaged with an alien spacecraft. He doesn't make any claims about the origins of the vehicle or whatever it was that he's encountered. He's simply saying that what he encountered was inexplicable and the sort of technology that he observed he can't explain. So the question here, I have this phrase, is Fravor justified in his belief? Now, I should probably rephrase that because we don't want to ask whether or not he is justified. He saw it, he experienced it, he witnessed it. So there's not really, of course, he's justified. Are we justified in believing Fravor's account? Now, I know I've made a lot of videos on this channel criticizing conspiracy theories and the sort of logic that is sort of utilized in support of these theories, but I just want to bite the bullet here and say that Fravor's account is probably one of the most if not the most well-documented UFO sightings that we have access to. And the reason why I say that is because of this sort of level of evidence. So what sort of evidence would we need to believe that Fravor saw what he claimed to have seen? Well, first and foremost, in the story that he just gave, he mentioned that there were other pilots with him. In fact, there was one that was in the same aircraft as he was, and there was another aircraft. I think there's 4 people total that he mentions. I believe all of whom, or most of whom, have come out in support of him. So we have the collaboration of the eyewitness testimony, in that they all say that they saw what Fravor said that he saw. Even more importantly than the eyewitness testimony, of course, is that we have video footage taken from Fravor's craft of the object in question. He was tracking the object with the equipment that he had on board his aircraft, and this was confirmed not only by his aircraft but the other aircraft, as well as the ship that they had flown off of. So all of this happening in conjunction with the release of the video. There's a lot of, I can't say a lot of, but there is documented evidence of the incident that he is referring to. So does this evidence support his belief? Seemingly so. Now we have to be very, very careful here that we don't extend the conclusion of all of this beyond the available evidence. Because again, what Fravor is saying is that this technology is beyond anything that he's seen or knows of in the US military. I don't think we can conclude from this testimony that this was some sort of alien, extraterrestrial, otherworldly craft. I think we just, as uncomfortable as it is, just have to say, yeah, we don't know what it was. Now, that's extraordinarily hard because most people don't like to sit there and most people don't like to live with that. We want to offer explanations. We want to jump to conclusions. But the fact of the matter is, we have very, very limited evidence to go off of, and we have to be careful not to extend ourselves beyond that evidence. Now, Fravor's testimony in its own right is pretty extraordinary. It's kind of crazy, and it's really remarkable to learn more about it. But the next testimony that we're going to hear by David Grusch, it blows that out of the water. We're going to deal with some even more, I don't want to say crazy or outlandish, but even more extreme, mind-boggling claims. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Let's start off with David Grusch's opening statement as well.
And we were direct report at the time to the DepSecDef. At the time, due to my extensive executive level intelligence support duties, I was cleared to literally all relevant compartments and in a position of extreme trust, both in my military and civilian capacities. I was informed in the course of my official duties of a multi-decade UAP crash retrieval and reverse engineering program.
Okay, so David Grusch starts off by explaining who he is and the sort of role that he's played in these UAP hearings and investigations in the past. He says here that he was informed, as he was in charge of this task force, of a decades-long UFO retrieval and reverse engineering program. So not only are they going out to find these UFOs, but they're trying to reverse engineer it to use it for in our own capacity. Now, he follows up on this and provides a little bit more detail in a response that he gives to a question that is asked of him.
Has the U.S. government become aware of actual evidence of extraterrestrial, otherwise unexplained forms of intelligence? And if so, when do you think this first occurred?
I like to use the term non-human. I don't like to denote origin. Keeps the aperture open, both scientifically. Right. Certainly, like I've discussed publicly previously, 1930s.
So the U.S. government has known about this and been involved with it since the 1930s. So going on 90 years, close to a century, we've been seeking out and reverse engineering these craft. And Grusch is very careful not to say that they're of extraterrestrial origins, but he does not disagree with the claim that it's of non-human origin. Now, of course, non-human, as we can see with the biologics that we're going to talk about before, can mean like an animal, but there aren't like raccoons flying crafts around, right? We're talking about aliens most likely, right? Okay, so let's go to another astonishing claim that Grusch makes in his testimony related to those non-human organisms that he referenced before.
You've stated that the government is in possession of potentially non-human spacecraft. Based on your experience and extensive conversations with experts, do you believe our government has made contact with intelligent extraterrestrials?
Something I can't discuss in public setting.
Okay, I can't ask when you think this occurred. If you believe we have crashed craft, stated earlier, do we have the bodies of the pilots who piloted this craft?
As I've stated publicly already in my News Nation interview, biologics came with some of these recoveries. Yeah.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I talked to that are currently still on the program.
And was this documentary evidence, this video, photos, eyewitness? Like, how would that be determined?
The specific documentation I would have to talk to you in a skiff about.
Gotcha.
So non-human biologics was recovered from these spacecraft, from these objects. Now, what does non-human biologics means? Again, it's not very descriptive. It just means a biological organism that's not a human. That could reference my dog that's laying over here. But of course, we're not talking about dogs or raccoons. We're talking about the thing that was intelligent enough to pilot whatever object they had recovered in our reverse engineering, right? Not to put words in Grusch's mouth. That was one of the more salacious things to come, but this next part is maybe even more damning or even more controversial in the sense that now we're going to be dealing with an actual conspiracy. And I mean conspiracy here in the classical sense, in that it's a cover-up or an attempt to keep secret what has been happening.
Thank you all very much. Have you faced any retaliation or reprisals for any of your testimony or anything on these lines?
Yeah, I have to be careful what I say in detail because there is an open whistleblower reprisal investigation on my behalf, and I don't want to compromise that investigation by providing anything that may help provide somebody information. But it was very brutal and very unfortunate, some of the tactics they used to hurt me both professionally and personally, to be quite frank. Yeah.
It's very unfortunate. As they say, when you're over the target, that's when they do the most firing at you. Do you have any personal knowledge of people who have been harmed or injured in efforts to cover up or conceal these extraterrestrial technology?
Yes, personally.
Have anyone been murdered that you would think, that you know of or have heard of, I guess?
I have to be careful asking that question. I directed people with that knowledge to the appropriate authorities.
Okay, so not only do we have the craft, but people have been hurt in order to keep this secret. And if I believe it's the senator sitting next to the gentleman that's speaking now is going to ask sort of a follow-up question to this line of questioning that I'll show now.
Thanks. I'm Ms. Luna.
Mr. Grusch, in speaking to you yesterday, I just wanted to follow up on Representative Raskin's questions. In the last couple of years, have you had incidences that have caused you to be in fear for your life for addressing these issues?
Yes, personally. Yeah.
I just want everyone to note that he's coming forward in fear of his life. To put in perspective, if they were really not scared about this information coming out, why would someone be intimidated like that?
Okay, not only have people been hurt in order to keep this a secret, but Grusch himself is now in fear for his life about the information that he is publicly putting forward now. So the intensity of this testimony has just gone through the roof, right? This is what's come out recently on all the different headlines and stuff that everybody's talking about for good reason. It's mind-boggling what's being said in this testimony here. Okay, so there are a lot of different claims here. And so we have a ton of different sorts of claims that are being made, and we can ask of each one of these claims the same question that we asked of Commander Fravor's testimony, which is there any justification to believe these claims? Do we have any available evidence to believe the things that Grusch is saying in his testimony? And here it gets a lot more complicated and a lot more iffy, because unlike the David Fravor incident, in which we have eyewitnesses who have come forward to support what Commander Fravor has said, as well as video documentation and technological documentation in terms of the video that's coming from the aircraft that he was flying, we don't have any of that, as far as I'm aware of, for anything that David Grusch has said. So that first claim there, that there was a multi-decade UAP crash retrieval and reverse engineering program, again, the standard of evidence for what we would consider evidence in this case, I think we're talking about a historical claim here. So this could be a whole host of things. I mean, the lowest form of evidence in that regard is going to be some sort of eyewitness that could come forward to verify the things that Grusch is saying. Historically speaking, we can look for some good, solid primary sources, some documentation. We do have documentation of past U.S. investigations into UAPs, such as Project Blue Book, right? Those are declassified documents that the public has open access to, that you can go through and review for yourself to look at the different sort of cases that were being investigated. And you can also read the conclusions from those cases, but we don't have anything to suggest. Project Blue Book, I think, is from the 60s or the 70s. We have no evidence to suggest that these sorts of investigations went back to the 30s. And more importantly, we have no evidence, at least in terms of official documentation, that anything was actually found. So, for example, when you look at Project Blue Book, it's an investigation of all these different cases, but there's no conclusive evidence or proof that's put forward about these objects themselves. They're simply investigating the testimonies that people had brought to them in the instances that are being talked about in these testimonies. Nothing along the lines of what Grusch has claimed in terms of reverse engineering, which implies that they have the physical object itself, has been brought forward. And of course, when you're making a claim like that, the ultimate proof, what we're really looking for, if you're claiming that we have the object and that we're working on to figure out what sort of technology the object is using, what we need to verify that ultimately is the object itself. If I tell you that my friend Marcus is a unicorn, what would ultimately prove to you concretely 100% that he is a unicorn if a unicorn walks through the door and I say, oh, hey, Marcus, there you are. Hello, friend, right? So what we would need would be to see the object itself. But at the very least, we need some sort of official documentation that Grusch can say here. Now, of course, because of his whistleblower status and the secretive nature of what he's talking about, he's going to say, I can't provide that, or I have to talk to you about that within a private, secure setting, right? The second claim related to what I just said, that non-human biologics were recovered from some of these objects. Again, at the very least, we need some sort of further eyewitness testimony to collaborate, because what Grusch is relaying is ultimately secondhand information. He's not saying that he himself has seen any of these bodies or non-human biologics. He's saying that people have told him that they have retrieved these things from these sites. So at the very least, bare minimum, we need those people to step forward and say, yes, I was there. This is what we got. But in terms of evidence, again, if we're talking about something that falls out of the range of commonly accepted things, which we are, non-human biologics that was piloting this craft, the bar's way up here. So the only thing that's going to satisfy that criteria is for us to see, test, experiment with that actual non-human biologics. Where are the bodies? Let's see them. What are you talking about? Show us, not me personally, because I'm not a biologist, but deliver the bodies to the nearest university and have the local biology department take. That's what's going to satisfy that claim, right? Now, in terms of the last claim with the death threats, that would be very difficult to demonstrate, but I think you would need some sort of like declassified files, in the sense that we would need evidence, not that the government's going to keep evidence to incriminate themselves in the first place, right? But we need to see some sort of evidence, whether in the form of documentation, video evidence, audio, whatever it is, declassified files that this stuff is actually taking place. I know that's not the exciting answer that anybody wants to hear, especially with the tremendous claims that are being made by people like Grusch. But in terms of justification and in terms of truthfulness, we have to be very careful and very meticulous when it comes to these sorts of things. Very careful about the types of conclusions that we draw from it. I am incredibly curious to hear what you think about all these different sorts of testimonies. If I have missed something and some other evidence has been brought to the table, please let me know. I find this all incredibly interested. I've been reading about this and watching videos about it all week. I'm incredibly excited about it. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I'll see you all next time.